So in this session, we are going to discuss about exception. So basically, the exception hierarchy looks like this. So it is important to understand the exception hierarchy. Object will be always at the top. Okay, for any object, for every object in the class, the root one is object. If you take a car object, or if you take a student object, or if you take a person object, so whatever you take, okay, even if you take a string object, for everything the root is the object. Okay, from there the next level is throwable. In the throwable there are two things, one is error and the other one is exception. And in the exceptions, again, there are multiple kinds of exceptions. One is IO exception, interrupted exception, runtime exception. Again, in the runtime exception you can see many things, and in the IO exception you can see file not found and EOF exception. Okay, so here broadly we need to discuss about what is an error and what is an exception. Okay, and in the exception, these are the things are there. Okay, no need to discuss everything. So at the high level we can discuss IO exception and runtime exception. Okay, so let's discuss about what is an error and what is a exception. So exception is something which occurs from the program. Exception is something which occurs from the program and that can be handled, is known as exception. When it comes to the error also comes from the program, but that cannot be handled. For example, so your RAM memory is over or your hard disk is full. Okay, you don't have the internet connection. Okay, so these kind of things, okay, are known as errors. Okay, we can't do anything. Okay, all of a sudden hard disk got full. You are trying to create a file where there is no space, hard disk is completely full. Okay, so which is not under the control of any program. Okay, so at that situation error will come and your entire program will be exit. Okay, we cannot handle the error. If error comes, your program will be halted. Okay, your program will be closed, terminated. Okay, but when it comes to the exception, so you can assume, okay, this piece of code might throw an exception, let's handle this. Okay, sometimes there are cases, sometimes compile only tells this piece of code you have to handle the exception, otherwise it'll be a problem. Okay, so let's see all those stuff. So IO exception basically when you are trying to interact with the input output devices, or when you are trying to create some files, delete the files, or try to modify some files. Okay, so that is how IO exception comes. Okay, when you're trying to uh, modify a file where there is no file exist. Okay, so in that case you can get file not found exception. When you're trying to read a file where you already read the entire content, again you are trying to read it. Okay, so in that case you can get EOF exception, end of file exception. Okay, and runtime exception, let's say you are trying to um, divide by a value. Okay, you are trying to divide by a value 0. Okay, so in that case a arithmetic exception will occur. Okay, so arithmetic exception, null point exception, and string index out of bound exception, and array index out of bound exception. You are trying to read an array, where, okay, where that particular index is not available. Okay, so in that case you are going to get array index out of bound exception. So all these things are considered into runtime exceptions. And again, these exceptions are broadly categorized, which are not mentioned in the hierarchy, but usually these exceptions are broadly categorized into two things. Okay, one is checked exception and one is unchecked exceptions. So checked exceptions are checked at compile time to ensure smooth execution of program at runtime. Okay, so if you are trying to deal with files, okay, so there are probably chance that the file may not be available, the file might be corrupted. Okay, so whenever compile sees that you are going to deal with the file operations, immediately it will tell. So So there you are trying to write a file operation. There could be a chance that the file may not be available or file could be corrupted. It's better to handle this exceptions, handle the exception right away before running itself. Okay, so that means checking the exceptions at compile time are known as checked exceptions. And unchecked exceptions, okay, so compiler will not ask you to handle it. Okay, and there could be chance that when you are reading an array, the index, you might be reading an extra index which is not available, or when you're trying to divide a value by zero, okay, or you are trying to divide a zero value, something like that. So in that case, it happens at the runtime. Compiler also doesn't know this kind of exception can come. So that's the reason compiler will not say that you have to handle it. Okay, let's discuss about the definition. Unchecked exceptions are checked at runtime and they occur at runtime. Okay, so let's do some coding and understand. Okay, this works well and good. A by b, zero by any value will works fine. So we're trying to divide by zero. Okay, so the a value is 5 and the b value is 0. You are trying to do 5 by 0. Let's see what happens. So you can say Java lang dot arithmetic exception. You are trying to divide a value by 0. So that's the reason this particular exception is thrown. Okay, so right now compiler doesn't know whether this particular piece of code will throw the exception or not, because it's a plain a and b. Okay, so it's a plain a and b. The compiler itself doesn't know whether it can throw the exception or not. Okay, because every time we pass different values, it doesn't know whether it can throw the exception or not. That's the reason it will not ask you to define an exception. Okay, so that's one thing. So these kind of exception, all the runtime exception and subclasses of one more definition for the unchecked exception, all the subclass of runtime exception and its subclasses, that is index out of bound exception, arithmetic exception, number format exception, or string index out of bound exception. Okay, so runtime exception in and its child classes or subclasses are known as unchecked exception. Okay, now let's say Now compiler is giving an error to you. Unhandled exception, type file not found exception. Okay, so it says that, so this particular piece of code is saying that I'm going to read a file. Okay, I'm going to read a file that is, that is temp.txt, which is available in the D. Okay, so at this moment compiler is telling you that there could be a chance that, Sudhir, you are trying to read a file. Okay, so there could be a chance that this file may not be available. Then how you can read it? Okay, it's giving a warning to you. It's giving a, you know um, it's giving a warning to you, so that you can, before it throws the exception. Okay, so let's handle this. Okay, there could be a chance that the file may not be available, so that time your program may terminated. It's better to handle now itself before running itself. Okay, so if the compiler says to define some exception, okay, those exceptions are called as checked exceptions. Okay, so basically checked exceptions are checked at compile time. Okay, so it clearly says file not found exception can be thrown, handle it. How do you handle? So you can handle. Okay, so this is a piece of code which is going to throw an exception. Okay, so you can keep a try here, and you can keep a catch. So what is that? File not found exception. Okay, and you have to specify, this is a syntax. Okay, so, and this is a some name, you can give anything. Okay, so immediately after the try, if catch has to be followed. Okay, so this piece of code may throw the exception, and if it is throw the exception, this catch will be pick it up. Let's run this one now. Start file operation. Okay, so let's try to read something. Dot read, and this is going to, the read is going to throw IO exception again. Define this one also. Let's import this IO exception. Now run it. Oh, again it is not thrown. So I'm expecting it has to throw an exception. The reason, okay, now it should. Okay, now you can see d:temp.txt, the system cannot find the file. So where it has thrown? So here itself, when you are reading itself, it has thrown. Okay, when you're creating a file reader object itself, it is throwing an exception. What is that? That's a file not found exception. Okay, you got this entire stack trace by calling this method. At this moment, Java has thrown an exception, and that is caught here. Okay, and by calling, so we got a file not found exception object, and by calling by calling print stack trace from the ex. Okay, so you'll be getting that stack trace. Okay, so when Java throws an exception, so that particular exception object will be caught by, right now it is caught by file not found exception, and using that object we print the stack trace. That's one thing you need to remember. So that's one thing. Let's say one more thing you require to remember. If I define this, ideally you will not be using it, but it is important whoever wants to write a Java certification. Let's say at this moment there are two errors here. Okay, let's see the error. Okay, before saying it, so we need to understand is exception is a root object for everything. Okay, so for every other exception, that could be IO exception or runtime or interrupted, for every other exception the root object is exception, and this particular exception is capable to handle any kind of exception. It could be a file not found, or it could be IO exception, or it could be a null point exception. So it is capable of handling each and every exception. So when a file not found exception is thrown here at this particular moment, when a file not found exception is thrown, so this itself will handle it, this catch itself will handle it. In that case, these two catches are never be invoked, these two catches are never be invoked. That's the reason we get unreachable code, unreachable catch block for file not found exception. It is already handled by the catch block for exception. Okay, so this is one thing very important to, you know, to make sure it works. You can keep it here at the end. So when file not found exception is thrown, this catch will be handled. When IO exception is handled, this catch will be handled. When some other exception, that could be any other string index out of bound or whatever it is, so when other type of exception is thrown, this particular catch will be handled. So in this case we never be, having any problem. This one thing. And I want to, and how we can handle this one. So there are two ways to handle this exception. One is you can keep the try block here. Okay, as I said, try has to be associated immediately with catch. Okay, let's run only the divide one. Let's comment this one. Okay, you can see arithmetic exception by 0. You can also print your own message. Okay, so once it is catched, you can also print your own messages. So okay, now let's see. Exception is caught and the stack trace you got it by calling e dot print stack trace. That's one thing. And you can also do like this. Instead of handle it, you can throw. This is one more important thing everybody has to understand. So instead of handling the exception in the divide method itself, you just throw it. You just throw it. In this case, it will throw the exception if any exception is, if any exception is thrown by the Java, and that particular exception is thrown back to the caller who called this divide. This divide is called by this statement at this location. Okay, so now it is required to handle the exception here. Okay, so again you can do two things. You can handle it by try catch exception e. Okay, you can handle it by like this, or you can simply throw it back. Okay, who call this ex divide? Okay, it is called from the main method. Just throw it, just throw the throws exception. So at this moment what happened? So a exception, the main method call this divide, and it is came here, and it has invoked this statement, it has thrown the exception, and this exception is thrown back to the divide, and divide is also not handling, that is thrown back again from the main method. Now what happens? Nobody is handling the exception. Okay, you just simply get the exception. You can see nobody is handling the exception. Okay, your program will be terminated. You can see, uh, for example, to understand it is not handled, I have to print xyz. If the exception is handled, so this particular statement will be executed and exception will be handled, and I have to invoke this xyz, but it will not be called. The xyz will not be printed. The reason is, so at the divide we are throwing an exception. Okay, the exception is thrown and program is halted. Okay, so that's one thing. Let's say if it is handled, if the divide is handled, if here itself it is handled, I'm handling the exception and I'm printing some useful message by calling the e.print status. Now just run this program. You can see xyz will be printed. Xyz is printed because the divide method is thrown the exception and we handled it and we printed some useful information, and as the exception is handled, the next statement xyz will be invoked. Okay, so that's one thing. And other thing is that one more thing you need to remember, there is a finally. Finally you can add after the exception, that's one syntax, and you can also add immediately after the try. Okay, after finally there should not be anything, this is the last thing. Okay, and try has to be, remember, try has to be associated with either by finally or catch. Okay, so if you do like this in between, if you do like this, you can see there are two errors. Syntax error, insert finally to complete the block statement. You can see here syntax error, tokenly finally delete this token, there are some errors will come. Okay, so try has to be associated with either finally or catch block, without which it will give an error. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so the finally is to, you know, let me tell you. Okay, so this particular finally will be executed whether catch is caught or not, whether the exception is thrown or not. Okay, so if the exception is thrown, it will come to the catch and it will also come to the finally. If exception is not thrown, okay, catch will not be executed and finally will be executed. Okay, let's see few things. Now in this case the exception should thrown. Okay, so exception is thrown. Okay, I'm not printing okay, let's do this one. Okay, you can see, so exception is thrown and finally is printed from the finally block, and after that the method is ended and it came to the main method again, it is printed xyz. Let's see, in this case we should not it should not throw any exception. Let's run this one. So the value is 2, 5 by 2 is 2, and we also executed finally and xyz. Okay, so it's nothing but whether the exception is thrown or not, finally will always be executed. Remember, whether the exception is thrown or not, finally block will be always executed. Finally can be associated with either try or with catch directly. Okay, the use of finally is to clean up certain code. Okay, clean up certain code. For example, so here I'm doing the file reader r equal to new file reader. Okay, so at this moment I got an exception. Okay, I got an exception, or let's say file is available. Let's say file is available. Okay, and it is unable to read. Okay, this file object will be created. Okay, but when I'm trying to read, it will throw IO exception. Okay, so when it throws the IO exception, it will come here and it will catch it. Okay, but the object which is already created or is not closed. Okay, in this case what we can do is finally we can do r dot close. So we can define the file reader on top, little bit top. So it is not so important, so anyway just understand it. Okay, so what you need to remember about the finally is that, so finally can be used to clean up the code. Okay, clean up certain code, that's it. Okay, now whether an exception is thrown or not, okay, the file will be closed. Okay, so even at this moment if the exception is thrown, okay, so here we are handling the exception and we are closing the file which is open. Okay, if the exception is not thrown, a file will be read properly, and at the end we are closing it. Okay, so for that reason we will be using it. If you try to do the r dot close here itself, okay, so why you are doing it finally, why can't you do it, why you are doing it finally, why can't you do at here itself? Okay, what happens at this moment, if at this moment if an exception is thrown, this piece of code will never be executed and will never be closing the file. So that's the reason whatever it happens, I want to close the file by using r dot close. That's the reason I'm defining it in finally. So when I'm trying to close that, okay, compiler again asking me to um, handle the exception, so I handle this exception. Okay, so that's about exception. You require to remember what is the file hierarchy and what is checked exception and what is unchecked exception, and how to define how to handle an exception in the method itself, or how to throw it back by using the throws keyword. Okay, so we already used throws exception. Okay, how do you throw it back the exception, this, and how to use a finally, why do we need to use a finally, when can we use a finally, finally can be used after the try or after the catch. Okay, and try should be associated with either with catch or finally. Okay, all those things, just go through it and re summarize all those things. Yeah, that's about exception.